basics about electricity so that you know a little bit about what's going on. Electrical shocks, how do you get them? Not that I'm trying to give you a recipe, but the difference between macro and micro shocks. How to avoid the electrical shocks, that sounds more reasonable. And the two things which are grounding and GFIC, which is the acronym for circuit breakers, are going to be in your home. And the two last ones, which are isolation and limb monitors, are going to be in the operating room. Those you can't get. And some talk about the standards based on a recent article that gives you an example. So is electricity good or bad? Well, there's good things. You can give anesthesia, right? That's our main goal. There's bad things in other countries that could happen here. And we're going to talk about this, which is, when you look at the sign, the color is pretty evocative, and then you see this goes directly to the heart. And that's the heart of the issue. So, electricity is bad because it can cause burns and explosions. Those are usually on your front page newspapers with high tension voltage wires. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about cardiac arrhythmias because that's what can happen to you at home or in the operating room. And this leads to differentiation between macro and micro shocks. And the severity depends on the intensity. The intensity of electricity is measured in amps. And that means we need to talk a little about the basics of physics. And Ohm, who was a physicist in the beginning of the 19th century, came up with this law, which was the tension, in other words, the difference between 2 points is proportional to the resistance times the intensity. You think of the intensity in terms of cardiac output, and you get this equation, which you're more familiar with, which is the difference, tension, blood pressure, is equal to SVR multiplied by cardiac output. Let's go back to electricity. If you divide both parts by the resistance, you obtain intensity is equal to flow divided by resistance. We know that. And flow being that difference in tension, U is divided by R, which is in electrical units, ohms. And this is about ballpark the resistance of the human body when it's driving from one end to the other. And this is what Edison put in his days to say, well, why don't we use 100 volts? Guess what? You still use it today. And there's a reason for this 100 volts, which is this will not allow the body to completely explode when you put 100 volts between it. Because that amount of intensity or flow that goes through it will not completely burn the patients. And this is more particular in the beginning of electricity when they're using DC rather than AC. A whole different topic. Use AC, and the basic laws of physics tell us that electricity goes through the least path of resistance. And the least path of resistance in the body is nerves, blood vessels, mucous membranes, i.e. wet stuff, as opposed to medium amount of resistance, which is dry skin. Don't put your fingers in the plug, especially if your feet are wet, that's more dangerous. And high resistance is tendon, road fat, and rubber boots, or whatever rubber shoes you're wearing in the operating room. That's the reason why you wear those. That's the chance of an electrical shock. Well, how do you get them? This is just like fires. You need a source of heat. You need some air or something to conduct the electrical energy. And you need to pick a victim. Whether in the case of fire, if it's the drapes or the patient, and in the case of electricity, I've got a couple more choices. It's more interesting. The electric source for micro versus macro shock, it's everywhere. You get to pick and choose. So the only one here that you cannot give a macro shock is this. Otherwise, fluid warmers, bogies, lights, monitors, OR tables. All these are potential sources for macro and micro shocks. The battery of your AICD/pacemaker can only give you a micro shock. I'll show you what's the conductive material. The conductive material, you have a plethora of choice. You have saline, you have irrigation fluid, cleaning fluids, bodily fluids, any kind of fluids will do. And you get a victim. Who would you choose? You got the choice between anesthesia, surgery personnel, and patients. Patients are kind of like the worst part in here because they can't feel the pain. They can't run away. They can't withdraw. They're paralyzed. The only good part is they're monos. If something's bad happens, at least you know about it. Usually the surgeons are going to which are fully trained. So are the circulating nurses. Anyways, so what's the difference between micro shock and micro shock? Why do we make such a big deal? The big deal is micro shock happens with very minute amount of electricity. Over 10 microamps is all you need. And I'll show you how low current that is. Here you need 10 millions. That's a sizable amount of energy. This both leads to the same consequence, ventricular fibrillation. The reason why you need so little electricity to get to VFib is there's a wire. And here's the wire. You have an isolated central line catheter. It goes directly to the heart. Yet somehow the electricity goes out of the body, returns, and you close the circuit, causing microshock and ventricular fibrillation. This occurs with a small amount of current, 10 microamps. You use more current, you need to go directly through an isolated catheter. You need 1,000 times more, 10 milliamps. Macroshock, preventable. Microshock, non-preventable. Again, here's your intensity of electricity, 0.01, 10 microamps, or 0.01 milliamps cause you to go into microshock. This is what the battery of your AICD in your patients does. Uses a very small amount of current, gives you a microshock, turns the VFib back into sinus, hopefully, or whatever it will lead to be. This is 10 microamps. At 1 milliamp, 100 times more, is the amount of electricity that goes into your tongue when you put your 9-volt battery to check if it's working. Oh, okay, it's good. It feels good. Let's do it again. No. This one you won't get to do again because at 8 to 20 milliamps, it's your let go current. It's the one that when you're playing around in the garage and put your fingers where you're not really supposed to. This one is, let's stop. Involuntary muscular contraction. You let go. When you give a little bit more, you're in that nerve stimulator where you're putting your femoral block. This can get you into macroshock and muscular contraction. The difference here is, just like we do in the op room, hopefully when the patients start feeling, you get tetany. This is what happens when people are on a wire and are getting shot, they're in tetany. Their brain still functions because the electricity isn't going through their brain, but through their arm down to their feet, and you want to let go. They can't. Why? Because flexor, our muscles are more important than extensor. Therefore, you both are contracted, but flexor wins. So, if you have a second person coming by who wants to pull that person away, Darwinian survival rules apply. If he's smart, he can grab him. If he's not smart, he grabs him. Third person, you get the if you give more current, like we do at Northwestern, very frequently, it's called external cardiac defibrillator. You put the pads between the heart, anterior, posterior, lateral, on the heart. And if you put them on the sides of the temporal lobes, it's called electrical convulsive therapy. It's medical applications of electricity. All in one. So, we talked about electrical shocks and how it's better to avoid them. we talk about how to avoid them at home with grounding. So this is my computer, right there. So it's got a voltage source coming from the floor. It's got an internal resistance, and this is the circuit. Now, as you can tell, there's a casing outside of it, so I don't put my finger. Now my computer broke down. There's a little hole. And when I put my finger, I get a little jolt. And that helps me prepare my presentations. It makes me up. So if this is the exposed piece, and you put your hand, you get a little zap. And because it's not very conductive, I don't get too zapped. If it were, it could be dangerous. So how to avoid this? Well, real simple. Don't put your fingers there, Dr. So what are you doing? Or add a fuse. Yeah, but I have to replace it all the time. Or get a class 2 equipment. What would that be? That would be the second solution that you use at home. If you've seen this, now this is circuit breaker. You guys see this right here? That's the. Oh, very good. So here's your ground explained in the schematic. What it is basically is your casing is attached with a wire of very low resistance to the ground. So let's make that hole again. Somebody puts their finger, and what happens is the circuit is not completed because the electricity will still continue to go, instead of through here, it will go through this casing and this wire. Therefore, no electrocution, everybody's happy, this will work. Why this doesn't work in the operating room is that this ground wire either gets tripped or something happens to it, such as an anesthesia machine rolls over the wire and breaks it off. So the problem is you can't for sure tell if it's going to work or not. You guys have bathrooms and kitchens? Do you have circuit breakers? Yeah. Cool. So if you are in a relatively recent building and you have a wet area, a kitchen or a bathroom, and somebody hands you the hairdryer while you have the hands in the other hand in the sink of water, not a good idea to take it, right? Nah, unless they're trying to do something here. And the reason why nothing will happen is if it's the hairdryer is plugged in here, which is a circuit breaker, and the circuit breaker will trip. Just doesn't. So if they're trying to hand it to you again and still pushing the button, there's a clue something's wrong going on there. Anyways, this is a ground fault circuit interrupter. It will trip and shut off all the power, and it's going to be the equivalent of a poor man limb iron, which I'm going to get to. This is pretty good. This is smart. You can put it on your extension cord. The reason it doesn't work out in the operating room we're getting at is you have a bypass machine. You can't just tell them, don't worry, I'll turn it back on in a minute or two. Or if you have light while they're holding the aorta. You need to have an alarm system in the operating room which will tell you something is going wrong before it happens or before it turns itself off. And it's not that you need to be able to chew cables like these rats, but when the anesthesia machine goes over, or the aorta goes over these cables and creates a short circuit, you want to make sure nobody gets shocked. So no shocks. So the two ways of doing that in the operating room are isolation transformer. And here's the schematic of how it works. If you get a circuit with a coil, the coil induces a magnetic field. Representation of the magnetic field by that circuit. Magnetic field induces inner coil. Mu induced current. This current is different. The reason it's different is because it won't close itself. So if you put your two fingers into the, I don't recommend that, the slot in the operating room, so you won't go down with your fingers down your feet and cause you to get a contraction, electroshock. So you have a casing again, and you have a limb, and this limb monitor is going to be attached to the ground and going to measure circuit, the amount of electricity that's being leaked out of the secondary line isolated piece of electrical equipment to the ground. Okay, so let's plug in Dr. Soga's computer up here. Let's recreate the hole and put the finger. What happens? Nothing. The circuit cannot be completed because this, even if you're standing on the ground, does not go to the ground. Okay? It will preferentially go through the line isolation monitor. So no shot. But that's no shot with one fault. The reason why you have to be careful is if there's two faults. So let's create two faults. Here's one fault here. Here's another fault in the casing over here. The circuit is completed, therefore you can get shocked. So if there are two faults in the line isolation monitor, you can still get shocked. There is no foolproof system. How about that line isolation monitor? Well, the advantage over the circuit breaker, as we said, is it doesn't make you lose the power. Here's an old system. It tells you how much electricity is leaking. It has an alarm system, which will make a lot of noise. And Northwestern, this is what it looks like. It's in milliamps, and it usually alarms between 2 and 5 milliamps. Okay? So, what does it mean? It's something bad's about to happen. Somebody will either get shocked, burned, and what do you do if it happens? You unplug the piece of equipment that was plugged in just the most recent. And you don't put it back. Leave it to the anesthesia techs to repair it. Okay? Limb monitors are no longer required since the 1987 code of the National Electrical Code. Here's an example. Albuquerque, New York, case report, rare to be presented in this journal, A&A. So what happened? The urology nurse goes to plug in an argon beam. Urology department, usually water and some type of bodily fluids on the floor. This is your argon beam. The Neptune suction system was already plugged in. And here's your extension cord, and the other nurse sees an arc of electricity between the nurse's head, arm, and extension cord. So they think she was probably faking it, so they have a look in her ear. Sure enough, she does have a tympanic membrane rupture. She has vertigo. She needed 2-week leave. It wasn't just faking. The cable was still warm 30 seconds after this happened. So, happening at Kaiser Permanente, there was an investigation. Interesting enough, the conclusion was, we're compliant. Don't worry, everything's okay. In the OR, because it's an old OR, there were no isolated power system, no circuit breaker, and there was no line isolation. It's published in June 2010. To get to the evolution of codes, you have to start in 1975. 1975, people sat down on 4 fathers. Let's do things safely. Let's get a circuit breaker or an isolation power system. Good job. 87, deregulation. Well, let's just do it if it's wet. 1990, more deregulation. Well, I don't know what's wet. If it's intimate to the patient or staff, does this mean that the staff is leaking bodily fluids? I'm not quite sure. Then we'll call it that. And if you're cleaning the room, incidental spillage of blood, urine, GI fluids, not wet. Starting to limit the definition of wet. There are no electrical standards per organization, state, nation, country-specific regulation. The Department of Defense had a global warming event occur in May 2007. Prior to that, they defined WET as cysto, arthro, and labor and delivery rooms. After 2007, that all dried up. CMMS, HSFA, Joint Commission did not address the issue. Neither do all these countries. That leaves us with the ASIC. In these non-operating room anesthetizing locations, that is code word for surgery centers. Only if you're doing wet stuff, arthroscopy, cystos, or breathing. It's not you shall, you should. Be careful choosing words. And on that, into questions. And you'll try to give you some more information.
So the question then becomes, what do you do with this knowledge when you go to the operating room on Monday? You know, what happens? I think what you need to do is identify what sort of power system you've got in your OR. Here at Northwestern, we've got an isolated power system and a line isolation monitor. That gives us an opportunity to make mistakes, which don't really affect the happenings in the OR. If we take a look at the table over there, we'll see a fluid warmer, a hotline box. And we're going to call that our main culprit for line isolation monitor alarms. One time a year, we plug in a hotline box and we hear a loud, audible, persistent alarm, and that's our line isolation monitor. It's different from all of the other alarms that we hear in the operating room, so the question becomes what do we do? The answer is undo what you just did. And that is almost always unplug the hotline box, the fluid warmer, and remove it from the room. But what we see in the operating room is no interruption in power. But because of the standards that we just talked about, it is no longer an obligation to have an isolated power system in an operating room. So you could have a regular power outlet like you would have in this room or at home in your living room, or you could have a circuit interruption like you had in your bathroom. The question is for you as a provider taking care of a patient, what do you do in a situation like that? In our situation, we remove the faulty piece of equipment and can continue to function. In a different environment, depending on where you're working, what the environment is going to be, you may need to not only remove that piece of equipment, but then reset your circuits. Whether it's a circuit breaker board or whether it's just pressing the button between those outlets, the question is, what do you need to do to get things functioning again? And the question that you ask yourself also is, you know, if you're in a position where you can choose what power system you have, how much can we bear when it comes to the loss of electrical? So can you deal with a couple minutes of electrical loss when you're dealing with an anesthesia machine or a piece of electrical equipment that's needed for surgery? So most of us will not be in a position where we're deciding what to use. But what we will be doing is we'll be in a position where we need to decide what to do in the event that we've got a faulty piece of equipment. You also see on the table that we've got a power strip there. As a practice here, we don't use power strips in our operating rooms because of things that you saw in that Albuquerque example. A power strip is a good source for getting saline or patient fluids or any sort of fluid that can conduct electricity. Also being on the floor, we have a tendency to roll operating room beds and anesthesia machines over those cables, which will cause damage. In an environment like we've got upstairs in our operating rooms here, if we do have a fault, we'll at least get a warning before we see a problem with our patients or ourselves. Without that system, we might be at greater risk.
We have one case presentation. So, you have a patient coming in the operating room on call. What is it? Saturday, the 4th of February, about 1:05 p.m. A patient gets rolled into the operating room. They just look there. Environment's wet. You put your monitors on and the patient's in. Come in, defibrillator, and plug it in. About to turn it on, and the limb alarm on the wall goes off. Makes this noise. And the patient's in. Yeah, can you do anything? And I think I saw on Grey's Anatomy you're supposed to hold it like this. So everybody clear? What would you like me to do for that? a new defibrillator. Very good suggestion. We get a new one, and the cables are cut off.
Unplug what you plugged in last before the defibrillator.
It's the defibrillator.
Oh, it was, yeah.
It's the last thing that we plugged in.
Oh.
But good point.
CPR.
We're going to do the CPR, okay. You want me to unplug it from here and see if it works on batteries?
Yeah.
It works on batteries, but the batteries tell me that they can't charge enough. I'm going to plug it back in if you don't mind, right? As I plug it back in, the Linmar over there on the wall is going to get really nuts.
Can you plug it into a different plug?
Yeah, I'll do the same.
Is it the cord coming from, is there?
Maybe. I'm going to open the box. Let's analyze. I'm going to go to 360. It's in biphasic. You like me to shock it?
Yeah, rubber boots on.
Huh? Put rubber boots on. Very good point. Why would I need to do that?
So that limb alarm's going off and you're going to shock the patient. The
I may
electricity-
get shocked.
You're going to get shocked.
But what if the patient gets shocked?
Well, they need to get shocked anyways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So other than the rubber boots, any other suggestions? Rather than holding these?
The pad one?
Just the pad.
Yeah, use pads.
So I think you identified all the problems here. Problem number one is two people are at risk, right? Patient getting shot and you. The advantage is you know that the patient needs the shot. You don't necessarily need it. You're probably better off without it. So, in order for you to avoid it, you know that's why your limb alarm is going off to tell you that something's wrong with this piece of equipment. Unfortunately, you have to use it. So, in order to put yourself at less risk, put the rubber boots, make sure you're not in a wet environment, put the pads. The other group suggested jumping up, which I could maybe I'd jump high enough. So, just to identify the problems and troubleshoot yourself. Think of who's at risk, how can you avoid the risk, maybe not use this piece of equipment, try to get another one, and use the batteries, you're less at risk of getting into trouble.